Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Joining you very early on a Tuesday morning, March 11th. I have a lot of stuff going on at the end of the week, but we wanted to get an episode out this week, so we might publish this a little bit early. Apologies for my voice. You can hear it's kind of quavering a little bit. I'm just getting over a cold, but it held up for most of the podcast episode, but please forgive me if I have to clear my throat a couple times. Email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you want to talk about anything you heard on this podcast. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Cheers, and I will see you out there. All right, good morning from Madison, Wisconsin, where it was 60 degrees yesterday, Rob. I'm out. I've got a nice view of the lake. The sun will start coming up here. I actually feel better than I have in 2 weeks. The cold is on its way out, but you can see that it has settled in my lower throat, and so I get to sound like Barry White for the entire podcast. I'm excited. How's it going?
Is it done? What did the groundhog say? Is this the end of winter or not?
Oh no, it's going to be 20 degrees tonight. It was a one-time thing. But for one glorious day, everybody was out and about here in Madison. I landed, and you would have thought I was in Los Angeles. People in shorts just running around, kicking balls, hugging each other, eating ice cream. It felt very idyllic. Well, I wanted to start with talking a little bit about markets, mostly because my sharpest indicator went off yesterday. My sister texted me about the market. For listeners who don't know, my sister does not follow this stuff at all. Whenever she texts me about something, I know that it has truly entered the zeitgeist. And so she texted me, "Hey, what's with the stock market? Is it going to go down some?" And I said, I was busy and I didn't really feel like responding. So I said, I also don't think she listens to this. So if she does, I'm going to get an angry call for spilling the beans on this. I said, I don't know. And then her next text message was really choice. She said, "Isn't that what you do for a living? Tell people what to expect and consult?" And I was like, "Ooh, okay." So that was the way my day started yesterday. The day started worse for markets in general. Although futures this morning, we're recording on Tuesday, not our normal recording time, up about 0.5%. But the market swooned quite a bit yesterday before coming back a bit. We talked the last time we were on the podcast, Rob. You talked about how Mr. Market was not happy and was trending downwards. So before we get into all of the things that we need to talk about in the world, is your thesis playing out? Is this a head fake? Like, what do you think about just sort of the last couple of days and about? And if my sister asked you, "Are stocks going to go down more?" What would you tell her?
To your sister, I would say yes. Yes, they are going to go down more. The question is over what time frame and how do we get between here and there? But just to tie this into sort of themes that we've talked about in prior conversations, this has been waiting to happen for a long time. Like, this shouldn't be a surprise. If this is surprising you, then you're not paying attention. Like, I don't mean to insult the listeners, but I mean, this is not exactly a shocking outcome. The two main issues in the market for some period of time have been the fact that U.S. valuations, and specifically U.S. large company valuations, have been just 2 or 3 standard deviations away from what they normally are, number one, and that U.S. profit margins have been extraordinarily extended relative to what they normally are. So that's sort of the double whammy that was providing this big bolus to the market. The second whammy, I'm not sure if that's the right phrasing here, but the profit margin angle is starting to crumble. And we talked about this last year, about how last year was sort of a perfect storm for margins because you were still benefiting from the pricing being pushed through at the corporate level to consumers. But a lot of the input prices like natural gas and food and labor had all already come off the boil. So you were getting sort of for a brief time harvesting huge profits, and markets were acting as if that were sustainable. And it clearly was not. And now we're starting to see the backlash. We're starting to see the other side of it, especially with the introduction of tariffs, which is bringing this into sharp relief. So really what you're getting is a degradation of expectations around profit margins in particular. Even as growth is slowing significantly, people are starting to throw the R word out there. And even as valuations are starting to now become something a little more normal. So yeah, that should continue. There's no significant catalyst on the horizon to jumpstart that back in the other direction. Like this is probably the start of a meaningful correction, if not, you know, outright bear market. Although I hate that term, it doesn't really mean anything. But the bad risk reward in the U.S. is coming home to roost. In other words,
Yep. Well, I think that's a good way to back into some of the things that have happened in general, because I want to tie that to ask you about how much of this would have happened anyway or was in the offing anyway, and how much of this is the Trump administration has it pushed it over the edge. Here's a very brief timeline of the Trump administration's approach to just North American tariffs. So on January 21st, they promised to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. On February 1st, they announced tariffs on Canada and Mexico. On February 3rd, they delayed tariffs on Canada and Mexico. On February 27th, they said that the previously aforementioned tariffs would go into effect March 4th. On March 4th, they imposed 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% tariff on all imports from China. On March 5th, Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump yelled at each other. One was accusing the other of using tariffs to stay in power. Later that day, the Trump administration paused tariffs on cars from Canada and Mexico for a month. And on March 6th, suspended most of the tariffs that were imposed on Canada and Mexico on March 4th, saying that really they would come into effect in April. I think it was April 12th that they would come into effect. And that does not count the steel and aluminum tariffs. It doesn't count the back and forth with China. It doesn't count the back and forth with Colombia. That's really just mostly what the Trump administration has been doing with Canada and Mexico. So the question here has moved on from what do tariffs do to the market to what does uncertainty about U.S. policy do to the market? Because one of the trite phrases is that things are priced in, and you can argue about whether tariffs are priced in or not. I think what was not priced in is that Trump would be Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Tariff, and that he'd be waking up every other morning and deciding, yes, tariff, no tariff, tariffs off, tariffs on, all these other sorts of things. Meanwhile, you've had meaningful changes in both Mexican and Canadian politics. So Mr. Trudeau has exited stage right. Mark Carney, the new prime minister, coming into an environment where President Trump has been reportedly threatening to revisit the issue of the Canada-U.S. border. You go on Twitter in some of these places, they're even talking about conquering, the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, things like that. Meanwhile, Claudia Sheinbaum, it was striking if you opened Mexican newspapers or looked at Mexican press yesterday. I mean, she was doing a victory lap. She was basically like, I'm so great. I saved Mexico from the tariffs. The tariffs are never going to come. I'm wonderful. Like, we have figured out how to deal with the Trump administration. So interesting to see how both sides of those are playing. We'll get into China in a second because China is playing it completely differently, but I'll save how China's playing the game. But the question I wanted to back into is, okay, like looking at bear market or whatever word you want to call it, are the tariffs causing that? Are they ancillary to it? Are they making it worse? And how are you interpreting this uncertainty? Because it's honestly, even for like people who keep track of this, listeners, like I have lost the thread a little bit. I'm waking up and I don't know exactly what's still on and what's off. It's a little bit disorienting.
yeah, and your job is to keep track of things for a living, so you can imagine how bewildered the average American businessman is or person on the street. Um, the way I would think about it is kind of twofold. Trump is an egomaniac with authoritarian tendencies. I don't think that's extreme to say. And the problem is he's applying that playbook in a system that remains fundamentally free. So he's trying to be very authoritarian in terms of putting policies on and off because that's his game that he plays. But he doesn't have the power to control the reaction to that. So, let's just take a few specific examples, right? And I think Mr. Market is really showing us the way here. Sorry, they're crinkling like bags in the background as if there weren't enough noise here usually.
That's fine. We don't normally record this early, so it must be around, what is it, second lunchtime for the French? They're probably eating little things and
Well,
having a nice time.
these are the Italian French, so they're
Oh, geez.
they're
Wow.
they're eating pizza and yelling. Um, so Mr. Market, as usual, shows the way, and I think it's really noteworthy. Like as we talk, you mentioned markets have gotten slammed in the last week in response to what's going on. Nasdaq down 10% in the last 1 month period. Excuse me. Small caps down 12 to 14%. You just had almost a negative 4% day yesterday on the Nasdaq 100. I mean, these are pretty hefty moves in terms of risk off and flight to safety. And yet the 10-year US Treasury yield over that same period is down 20 basis points. And the 30-year US Treasury yield is down 15 basis points. It's nothing. And what that shows you is that markets are pricing in more uncertainty, more inflation. That is sort of this is the sound of institutional trust getting pissed away. And that's really, really important because once you lose that element, it's very difficult to get it back. So the long-term bond yields are really showing this up. Um, More generally, I said there was two ways I would think about it. I would look at that market response. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about in terms of framing this is during the first Trump administration, we are, as we said before, in a deflationary kind of environment. There was a lack of aggregate demands. We needed something to kickstart activity, and Trump had a galvanizing effect. By any standard, there was a galvanizing effect to demand, and you could argue how successful it actually was. But now in round two, the preconditions were totally different. We were not suffering from demand; we're suffering from supply, and I think you're seeing the impact of that because Trump is not a galvanizing force, especially because now he's sort of doubling down on a lot of this and acting in even more extreme ways. He is a destabilizing force. Like we've reached a tipping point where this is no longer good medicine. It's poison for the U.S. and for the international scene. It's reached the point where now he's galvanizing the external scene, which had been sort of stuck in previous ways. So it's almost like a progression from what we saw in 2016. But I mean, that's how I would view sort of the dynamic between him trying to control everything and throw his weight around and the market response.
Yeah, I don't. I'm struggling with whether I buy the characterization of him. The authoritarian tendencies and things like that. I wonder if Mr. Macron is rubbing off on you a little bit, or at least the Europhilicness is rubbing off a little bit. Because I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt analytically, but one thing that I had trouble squaring, and I'll just quote President Trump from his appearance on Sunday Morning Futures, where he said, this is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. It takes a little time, but that should be great for us. But then he was asked if a recession was imminent, and he said, well, I hate to predict things like that. Look, we're going to have disruption, but we're okay with that. What I have to do is build a strong country. You can't really watch the stock market, end quote. And this is coming from a guy who seemed to do nothing but watch the stock market as a barometer of the economy. How many times have we heard that the stock market was doing great under the first Trump administration? And this was a signal that the economy was extremely strong. And the question that I'm leading up to is like, let's try to give him the benefit of the doubt here. He's trying to bring wealth back to America. He's trying to get these freeloading trade partners to pay their fair share. He's trying to reindustrialize all of these different things. And how does taking tariffs on one day and taking them off one day and like moving all over the place actually accomplish that? The unsatisfactory answer I've been sitting with is, okay, well, at least with Canada and Mexico, it's probably a part of a negotiation with the U.S. Mexico Canada free trade agreement. But if that's true, he's shooting himself in the foot there too, because now both of those governments are just sitting back and looking at, oh, okay, we just deploy 10,000 troops to the border, or we say something really nice and ingratiating to him, and everything is fine. And you're not going to get the actual movement you need on the negotiation itself. So I just, even if he's an let's say he's an authoritarian, what is this schizophrenia about tariffs accomplishing? Like, do you see any kind of strategic goal that it's in service of that I'm missing?
But turning them on and off like that, no.
Yeah.
I think that's purely an expression of his personal whims and personal power, um, with unintended consequences. Like, let's just take one specific example because it's very easy to speak in the abstract. But if you look at so in the list that you had posted on Twitter of the timeline, I thought it was interesting that it said the Trump administration orders the greater production of U.S. timber, which really caught my eye because, they're trying to tie that into the Canadian tariffs. And let's just pause and consider that for a moment. So I read the order, and basically what it says is they're doing these emergency studies where, you have to come up with a plan to increase U.S. timber and lumber production. And then on federal lands, they're going to accelerate the production of timber. That's their plan, and the stated rationale is that the U.S. is too dependent on lumber imports. So let's just unpack that for a second. So for context, the U.S. imports about 25% of its lumber, and it's all from Canada, because Canada, obviously has a lot of lumber in the Pacific Northwest. It's not a huge portion. But the background to this, and the reason why this is so ironic, is the timber market does not need more supply. Like lumber, we're not hurting for lumber. Lumber prices are not doing well. And ironically, on the timber side of things, we've been in literally a multi-decade, just terrible, terrible bear market because there's too much supply of timber. Because in the housing bubble of the early 2000s, like remember, like the endowment model was the hot thing, and all these endowments were buying up timberlands, and it's the stewardship of the long-term capital and wealth, and we're gonna trim these trees 1 year at a time. Like everyone just got a big, hard on for this metaphor. Pardon my language. And as a result, we had just enormous supply of timberland, especially southern yellow pine timber, like in the region kind of near where you are. And if you look at the prices of timber, because after the housing bubble fell apart, like timber lasts a very long time. And it just grows and grows and grows and grows. And if you don't cut it down, it doesn't go anywhere. And so we've seen like a 20-year, accumulation of too much timber supply, and the pricing. So if you look at Alabama pulpwood pricing, which I have in front of me, the pricing for hardwood has been flat since 2014 in nominal dollar terms. So that's terrible. That's terrible. And they're saying that you're gonna, like, the executive order is to increase timber from federal lands, as if that's the constraint here. And the reason why I bring that up is, like, obviously that itself is just completely misunderstanding the background, and I'm not sure where that comes from. But two things that were really interesting. Weyerhaeuser is probably the biggest timber owner and producer in the US. The ticker is WY. And they were asked about this at a recent conference. And they basically said, like, well, federal land is even older, because as the trees get older, they get bigger. And they said federal land hasn't really been harvested very much because they have been trying to preserve the market or help the market as much as they can, because they don't want to dump federal logs onto the market. But now the trees are 40 to 50 years old, and they're too big for most of the lumber yards that we have, because they're not made for that diameter of
Mhm.
logs. So the CEO of Weyerhaeuser was just like, yeah, it's not gonna, like, we're just gonna have a bunch of logs sitting around, and we can't really do anything with them anyway, and we already have more than we need. So that was interesting. And then the other thing is, if you look at one of these sort of lumber and timber industry authorities, like a think tank kind of thing, they put out an official response to the presidential decree. And one of the things they point out is, quote, uncertainty about industry investments. And they say another concern about the decree is the temporary nature of this directive, getting to Trump's, on again, off again approach. The lack of long-term policy stability makes it difficult for industry players to justify significant capital investments in new mills or processing capacity. So getting again to the issue of, if you act in this behavior, if you act in this way, you you don't encourage investment. You don't encourage the supply growth that's supposed to be emerging, supposedly, to replace the tariff blocked imports. So it's just shooting yourself in the foot. That's the moral of my story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. It wasn't just endowments. I mean, Southern families were, instead of like putting their money in the market, thought about planting timber for the long run and thinking they were going to put their kids through school with the proceeds from timber sales, and that didn't happen. So there is this oversupply, particularly in the U.S. Southeast. But it's been a couple of years since I looked at this. But my understanding is the bigger problem there is, to your point, to your last point that you just made, is about lack of mills and lack of processing capacity because all the mills have gone away. I grew up in a town next to a little small town in Georgia called Covington, Georgia, which was originally a mill town. Like the main road that goes through the town was the mill town, was the road that brought the milled wood from Covington to Atlanta. Shout out to Pete Carter if he's listening to this podcast. Hope you're well, Pete. I only know that because you took me on a drive of this and taught me all this. I hope I got it right. Um, but all of that has been going away, which is that this goes back to the question about, well, then what is all of the on again off again about? Because the Trump administration is right on the precipice of what I would describe as actually really good policy, because you do have this glut of supply and you have many people and endowments and things like that who have been hurt by the way that the market has been structured. So why not have a full force of government effort to build mill capacity and for the US government to buy up excess supply to build, I don't know, whatever you want to build, with maybe build some new rest areas. I don't care. Like find something to build with the lumber itself. Take the lumber off of the market. Support the building of new cutting edge, even mobile mills and things like that, so that you can start to harvest things in a more efficient way. And maybe in the context of the renegotiation with the USMCA, maybe you shove some lumber down the Canadians' throat. Maybe you use this new capacity and this new efficiency to become an exporter yourself of some of these different products, and you give new life to this particular commodity. Like, I'm not saying I agree with that policy, but at least I can see, okay, like if what you want to do is fix this problem, like tariffs would be one part of a broader government effort to try and fix a market inefficiency that has hurt American consumers and that I think is too big for the market to solve itself. But they're, to your point, they're not doing that. Like there's an executive order, then there's a tariff, and then it's on to the next thing. And the actual problems are not getting fixed themselves. And that's the part that's head scratching for me, because they're rubbing shoulders against a lot of problems that everybody knows are problems. They, in the context of the campaign, they were able to speak to those problems better than the Democrats. That's why they're in the position that they're in. But now push comes to shove, and it's just the table is waiting for them to just sit down and do it, and they won't do it. They're going on Fox and saying, "Oh, we got a recession. Oh, like we're going to do tariffs here. Oh, we're going to do this." Like I don't understand like what is happening from the strategic perspective there, and I want to believe I'm missing something, but maybe to your point, maybe it's just a lack of comprehension or a lack of caring about what the issue is. I don't know.
Well, part of the reason why I say it's the authoritarian playbook in a fundamentally free society is that I'm not sure that they have the capacity to handle these issues. So, for example, just to continue on the lumber thing, like we don't have a lack of lumber capacity. We have too much capacity. As you point out, the lumber mills are closing down. And that's not just like an old thing. Even in the last year, 4 billion board feet of lumber capacity shut down because there's just supply and demand just doesn't make sense. And if you want to address the bottlenecks in the system, it's not that we don't have enough lumber capacity, it's that we aren't building enough homes. People want homes. Home prices are too high. People are desperate for places to live. And for some reason, whether it's permitting or land or labor costs or all of the above combined, we're just not getting enough through the chute to soak up that lumber capacity. So that's fine. And ordinarily, the market would eventually figure it out and find a way. But in this case, you have sort of a very aggressive administration that's trying to say, okay, it's this thing, and we're going to push on this lever. And it's just the wrong lever. And it's not even pushed with consistency or thoughtfulness, as you point out. And the upshot is the 30-year treasury yield is not going down even as recession gets priced in, because that's what happens is the uncertainty increases and it just makes everything worse.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I keep trying to do that, they're at least talking about the right issues. I'm not sure that the previous administration was talking about some of the issues that mattered most, but the approach is, if they keep on doing what they're doing, they're going to break things, and they're going to leave things worse than how they found them. Which maybe is a good way, Rob, to segue into, I don't know if this is the flip side of the coin or if it's just another version of the coin, checking in on China. China's been responding much differently than Canada and the United States to U.S. tariffs. You had, I'll read this quote from at least one Chinese foreign ministry source about some of the tariffs. Quote, intimidation does not scare us. Bullying does not work on us. Pressuring, coercion, or threats are not the right way of dealing with China. If war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. End quote. You can just imagine what Donald Trump thought in his head when he read that. I saw you and I both looked at an interview with David Lee, a professor at Tsinghua University. He did with David Ingalls on Bloomberg. And I'll quote him too. He said, let me be very frank. Among the top three challenges for the Chinese economy, U.S. tariffs wouldn't even make the list, end quote. He said that China was preparing for 60% tariffs, and what has been sort of passed through is much less than what China was worried about. So interesting that China was prepared, and maybe the worst will come, but China was preparing for much worse, and it's actually gotten less than it thought. So in some sense, like tariffs aren't that big of a deal for them. But two interesting things that happened in the last couple of weeks with China as they push back against the tariffs. Number one, the deficit spending is at its highest level now in years. Approaching 4% target for fiscal deficit to GDP. And the government also announced a government-backed fund that will mobilize 1 trillion yuan, that's about $138 billion, from social capital to support technology startups. And in particular, they want to focus on hard technology. So things like semiconductors, renewable energy, areas where China already has a big advantage, or at least has the potential to have a bigger advantage as well. So it's been a little while since we checked in on China. I wanted to ask you, is the Chinese consumer consuming? Is the government taking out policies that will make the Chinese consumer consume? And how do you react to how China is planning things? Is there more logic to what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, or are they stuck in the same sort of vortex as the Trump administration, where they know what the problems are, but they're pulling the wrong levers?
Um, I think one of the ironies is, in some ways, the U.S. needs to become more like China, and China needs to become more like the U.S., and neither of them can really do that because it involves fundamentally changing their stripes. Um, in the Chinese case, uh, I mean, the whole consumption thing, we've talked about this ad nauseum. At the end of the day, to have a durable increase in Chinese household real wages and Chinese household consumption, and by association, the power of individual households relative to business and government in the Chinese system, you need a major unwind of the policies that support business and government at the expense of households. And without a fundamental rethink of the whole Chinese system, it just ain't going to happen. So all the stimulus, like what stimulus, you know, nothing has really changed in that discussion. The thing that I think is more interesting, I think that the tariff thing is broadly correct when they boast that they're really not worried about it. Um, the issue that really it all comes down to over and over is that trade settles multilaterally, and the tariffs that the U.S. is using are, for the most part, bilateral. So if the U.S. had put 60% tariffs on the whole world, that would be a very big deal, and China would suffer greatly from that, just unavoidably, because the U.S. has been the demand provider of last resort. Um, but because trade settles multilaterally, even in a very bad case scenario where there was 40, 50, 60% tariffs, you would see major pain, but the system would eventually correct, just like it did if you look at the specific examples we've looked at in the past where, big tariffs on tires, ultimately they get redirected through Vietnam, or big tariffs on, this product or semiconductors. You know, I just read NVIDIA's 10K filing, and the amount of growth that they've seen out of Singapore, wink, wink, has been just extraordinary. It's almost matched the amount of growth year over year that they, in dollar terms, that they did through the US. So all of that is Chinese, buying through back doors and getting access to things that they shouldn't. So markets find a way, and unless you're going to absolutely put up the drawbridge on the U.S., which would be pretty disastrous, um, I think it's correct that they don't have much to worry about long term from the tariffs, which doesn't mean that they don't have a shit ton to worry about, because again, like, they have to become more like the US and encourage liberalization and sort of innovation and the private sector, which is something that they're struggling with. Um, the venture capital thing is really interesting, because the term that catches my eye is hard tech. Um, like, what is hard tech? It basically means startups that are capital intensive, because venture capital doesn't like that. No one likes to invest in startups that require a ton of incremental capital to grow, which is why everyone likes software, because it doesn't require incremental capital to grow. Um, and hard tech had sort of a brief moment in the sun when everyone was in cloud cuckoo land in 2021 and discount rates were in the floor. But now that's really changing, and it looks like it was kind of a flash in the pan. So I think the fact that China is promoting this VC sort of public-private partnership focused on hard tech is kind of interesting, and it does play to their strengths because it ultimately solves for the bottleneck, which is the private sector's unwillingness to deploy significant incremental capital into growth areas. And that's something that China, like, they have a giant fire hose of capital. And now they've been spraying it at the property market, spraying it. Now that, that's just, it's blowing up and they need to turn it on something else. So, this is actually a fairly high return way to do that. So I think it's broadly positive, and it shows kind of the direction that you can expect them to go, which is doubling down on semis, doubling down on hardware, doubling down on energy and grid technology, and all of these sort of areas that are within the wheelhouse of the existing economic system and can be positive ROI and can drive growth to some extent, if not to the same level that we saw, in the past 2 decades. Um, but yeah, I think it shows you the blueprint that they're leaning toward.
Yeah, it's a couple of other things that China has done to respond. They put their own tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, something that I've talked about for a long time now. That U.S. ag producers would be at the front of the trade war. There are also rumors of maybe a Xi Jinping Trump meeting coming up in May or June. So maybe it's all posturing for some kind of deal. But the bigger news of the last week was for Canadian farmers. They put 100% tariffs on things like on peas and canola and things like that. 25% tariffs on some other aquaculture things. Big moves there. Goes to show you, by the way, that China is trying to take advantage of the U.S. Canada dissension, trying to drive that wedge further between them, and maybe they'll be successful. Maybe they won't. I don't know if you also noticed this as well, Rob, that Russia imposed fees on Chinese electric vehicles that have been basically overwhelming Russia. So their partnership has no ends, but Russia doesn't want all of these cheap Chinese electric vehicles to come into the country itself. By the way, the idea of Chinese EVs in Russia, where the sun doesn't shine for like months of the year, is a little bit funny to me. But even Russia, a country that has aligned itself with China in some ways, is having problems with Chinese overcapacity, and it's soaking it up. So, to your point, yes, they can say all these things about, okay, we're increasing consumption, we're doing this. Like, when push comes to shove, they're not actually doing it very much. Okay, anything else you want to say about China before we move on to the next topic, Rob?
No, let's move on.
Okay, well, I think we do need to talk about Europe a little bit, and this may be a way to talk about Turkey as well before we round out the episode. Because I think our pro Europe, our pro view, our views, our positive views on the European Union, in some ways have been the most controversial. They're the ones that I get the most pushback about on the podcast, but they're looking pretty good to me. So since we were last on the podcast, we talked about German election results. We're now seeing the German government come out and say they want defense spending above 1% of GDP exempt from the debt brake. They want a 10-year, is it 500 billion euros? Is it a trillion euros? We'll see. Special fund for infrastructure. They want looser debt rules for states. They want more debt brake reform in Germany. They also want to ease fiscal rules at the EU level and increase deficit spending. Friedrich Merz, in a speech last week, said, in view of the threats to our freedom and peace on our continent, whatever it takes must now also apply to our defense. Again, scares the crap out of me that a German chancellor is saying such things. Also, an obvious invocation of Mario Draghi and of whatever it takes to save the EU. Like, now that's how Germany is talking about spending on defense and on infrastructure. It was also a particularly big week for Poland. Poland had Poland's president Donald Tusk. He gave a speech where he mentioned three really concerning things. He mentioned nuclear weapons, so the chance for nuclear proliferation. He mentioned more than doubling Poland's standing army, giving training to every single Polish citizen so that they could serve in the army. That would take Polish, troops to over 500,000 soldiers in arms, and then also withdrawing from something called the Ottawa Convention. The reason they want to withdraw is because there are restrictions as part of that convention on landmines, and Poland is talking about mining its border with Russia. There was also a really high level disagreement between the Polish government and Elon Musk, and even Marco Rubio decided to weigh in, where Elon Musk was talking about taking Starlink away from Ukraine. Starlink is what allows Ukraine to basically have the internet. Poland came out and said, well, I mean, Poland pays the cost of that at $50 million a year. You need to stop threatening the victim here. Otherwise, SpaceX was an unreliable provider and we'll have to find alternates. And Elon Musk said, be quiet, small man. You pay a tiny fraction of the cost and there is no substitute. And then Rubio weighed in and, of course, said, yeah, we should be getting thank you from Poland rather than these other things. This is becoming a refrain, by the way, now that all of these U.S. political leaders want thank yous from the rest of the world for the pleasure of whatever it is that we're giving them. An interesting way to do diplomacy. I didn't mention anything about France. I mean, Emmanuel Macron seems to be leading the charge. His poll numbers finally ascending as a result of all the things that are happening with the United States. So take that in any direction you want, Rob. We can talk about the EU. We can talk about Germany. We can talk about Poland. Tell me what you're hearing on the street in France. Are people, feeling very skeptical about the United States? Take it whatever direction you want.
Well, I'll start with an anecdote and then go into some data, which I thought was interesting. The anecdote is, it was beautiful this weekend. I didn't want to rub it in with your 60-degree Madison day, but it's full on spring here. So sun is shining, everyone's out, and walking around the streets this weekend with my kids, all I could hear were people talking about the army and Trump and politics, and that is the first time since I've spent significant time here, which is going on 10 years now, that I've actually heard random conversations on the street of people discussing world events. Life is too good here, usually. People are focused on living well and what they're going to eat and that sort of thing. That is a very noticeable change, and it's purely anecdotal, but it is pretty significant, I think. The other thing that caught my eye was there was a foreign policy piece that I think you sent me. I don't know where I found it, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where the guy was saying that one of the benefits or one of the advantages that Europe has is that it maintains a lot of its industrial and manufacturing base. And I think that's a really interesting point. He pointed out that the EU has 30 million manufacturing employees versus the US has 12 million, something we've talked about a lot in the past. And that as a percentage of value add, the EU manufacturing is at 16% versus 11% in the US. So the EU definitely out manufactures the US, which is important, because getting back to the tariffs and, lumber and all those issues, a big part of the US problem is that it's trying to spur domestic capacity in manufacturing, but without any of the preconditions that would allow that to happen. Whereas the problem of the EU was that they had all this capacity, there was insufficient demand, it wasn't enough investment related growth to sop it all up, but they engaged in, what at the time was derided as sort of political giveaways and ridiculous, non-liberal handouts to support these industries. And now that looks like it's not a bad idea, because they have more of the raw materials to work with now that demand, as you point out, in the German case, is starting to get unleashed again. And that I think is the big takeaway is like Europe has lacked for something to invest in, um, because of, a whole number of reasons, partly because the credit cycle is different. And unlike in the US, we don't have sort of a manufactured enthusiasm or bubble every 10 years to spend a ton of money on, which is both good and bad. I'm not just bashing the US. Um, but now, given the surge in demand, like some of the raw materials are there. I think it's an underappreciated sort of advantage that Europe has in terms of raising its own drawbridge a little bit and starting to get its act together.
Well, and this is one of the areas where policy does matter a little bit. The execution of these broader strategic goals matters. And we talked about how the US is not really executing. We talked about how China has trouble really executing. Europe obviously has problems, but the European Union actually has been executing a little bit. So if you look at just the past couple of months, they just signed a new digital trade deal with South Korea. They're reinvigorating talks around a free trade deal with Mexico. We talked about how maybe they're going to get a free trade deal going with India. There's some very interesting things happening with Turkish EU relations. You've got Turkey coming out and saying that it's a matter of common interest for Turkey to work together with Europe to help secure their future and to help have coordination between defense. Also, talking about Turkey maybe becoming a full member of the European Union in general, which would be, I mean, there are a lot of political, cultural hurdles that have to happen for that to occur, but it would really change sort of how demographics and industrial capacity, like all those things, would sort of change overnight. So you look at the way that the EU is trying to push forward here, exactly to your point. They have the crisis, and now we're at least getting them talking about the right issues, and it looks like they're grasping for some of the right levers. Now, I can already hear some of the skeptics coming. Like I had a friend send me an article yesterday evening that the Greens are going to try and block the infrastructure fund that MERS is trying to create in Germany, which is kind of silly. And you're going to get all these different countries that are going to try to back things up, and eventually, I think EU reform is going to have to happen. But to your point, I think when we look back at the Trump administration, many years from now, I think we'll say that one of their biggest mistakes was underestimating Europe. I think the Trump administration thinks that Europe it's old and it doesn't need to be thought about anymore, and they need to transition U.S. interests at the Pacific. And yes, Europe is old, and yes, it's been rusting on its doldrums and all these other issues, but it's not. It's not a poor place. It's not an unpowerful place if it wants to be. And underestimating them, I think, is going to create not necessarily a competitor for the United States, because Europe and the United States are going to be on a lot of the same issues, but certainly Europe is not going to do whatever the United States wants. And this, I think, leads actually sort of dovetails with what we were just talking about, which is Europe has taken some of the U.S. line on China, has been skeptical. Now, of course, like the China dumping all of these different things like cars into the European market, like that also doesn't help very much. So there's been a European reason to push back against this because China has really threatened the German export miracle, and that does drive the European economy. But you would think that that's something that can be solved around. And if Europe is interested, or at least if it's already lost the United States from an economic or trade perspective, and even as a reliable ally, then why not make some kind of deal with China? Why not make some kind of deal with Turkey? Why not do all these different things to try and make Europe better? And on these certain areas, like Europe is further along. Yes, they don't have the military. Yes, they don't have the tech, super giants that the United States has. But it has all these other different things that are going to be really critical for a multipolar world in which they can turn on relatively quickly.
Yeah, and I think people forget too that, the double-edged sword of kind of the state-driven model in Europe. In many cases, it doesn't work well, but in times like this, it does work remarkably well. Like that's one thing. Like France is very state-driven, of course, but the bureaucrats here are actually really competent. Like the best people in society mostly go and work for the government. And that's one thing you can count on is like shit gets done and it's pretty efficient and well thought out. It's state driven, but when there's a big project, like you don't just throw money down a hole for the most part. Um, you know, comparing that you know, to the timber example before, I think that's one of the areas where the US is going to struggle by comparison, is if it's trying to engage in industrial policy, it doesn't have the human capital, it doesn't have the structures in place to do that particularly well. And Europe kind of does in some ways. So that's a big change. The other thing, and I'm going to hypothesize and push back if you think this is wrong. My sense is that we're sort of in the Goldilocks zone with the Russia threat because it's imminent enough, and the shock from the US kind of about face was enough to really galvanize people into action. But it's not like, Russia is driving tanks, across the northern European plain yet. So in terms of actually building out capacity and doing it in a thoughtful way, like two of the news items that caught my eye this week were, first, a disagreement between France and Germany over whether they should uh, ensure that arms procurement is done only from EU sources, or whether they should open that up because of the urgency of the situation to outside providers. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. And then the other thing was the pushback against Georgia Maloney for the Starlink deal, which she appeared close to agreeing. It must be serious because the picture of her with Elon was wearing a suit. So, it must be a pretty big deal. He doesn't break that out only for the Chinese, I think. So, Georgia Maloney is in rare company. But there's been a huge backlash against that, saying that we can't give this. It's a contract for state and military purposes in Italy, and basically saying we can't trust Starlink with this, and we can't give them this contract, even though the next best option is not particularly great. Like, we have to figure this out, and that's not acceptable. And it appears that that's going to get squashed. Um,
It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Italy, because Maloney is a really interesting figure for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things that makes her unique as a figure on the political right in Europe is she has all of those sort of right wing populist credentials, but she's always been very anti Russia. And she's always talked about how Russia is a threat. And there is this insidious sort of pro-Russian, admiring Vladimir Putin thing in the European right. It never ceases to amaze me, by the way, because this was true of the opposite side during the Cold War, that it was the left that was looking up to the Soviets, and now it's the right that is looking up to Putin's authoritarianism. It goes to show you that, in some sense, politics is really a circle, and we should stop talking about left and right wing, because those terms don't mean anything anymore. But for a person of her, policy preferences, she's always been unique in the sense that she does think Russia is a threat, and she does want to push back against Russia. Um, so I can understand her wanting to buddy up with the Trump administration and with Musk, because that's the language that she speaks mostly from a policy perspective. But exactly to your point, how do you go from that to Musk insulting Poland, and causing a diplomatic incident there, and taking Starlink away from the Ukrainians, and being part of an administration that has really, at least, is showing that it's trying to turn its back on Ukraine, or has taken Russian talking points and starting negotiation processes with these. That's going to put her in a very, very difficult position, and she'll be caught between. She probably doesn't want to sign up just for whatever France and Germany want to do with the EU. She probably sees the writing on the wall that Italy is going to have to go along with whatever, whatever Paris and whatever Berlin say. And Italy is, of course, not going to like that. So can they generate some leverage by, oh, we have better relations here, or we have this thing or that thing? It'll be very interesting to see if and how Italy falls in line here.
and can I ask a question? Maybe this is too big of a question for toward the end of the podcast, so feel free to punt. But I'm genuinely curious your thoughts on Poland's situation. And, like, if you look at the interviews that you had done in the past with Jacek, like, he had a pretty strong view that Poland was not going to hew to the general EU line, that it was sort of creating its own area of influence, the intermarium, and partly using U.S. leverage and its strong relationship with the U.S. to get that space for itself. How how does that change now? Like, with everything that you just mentioned, and what Poland has been saying publicly, is that going to be very different from that vision?
Yeah, if listeners have not listened to the episode with Yatsik, you should go back and listen to it. He was very, very prescient in a number of ways. He called a lot of this stuff before it happened. Remember, though, about Yatsik. So number one, he's a geopolitical strategist. So he's thinking about not necessarily what's going to happen, but what he thinks is in Poland's best interest. And number two, unlike someone like me who is, tries to divorce himself from politics and is focused much more on, objective views on investing and, things like that, Jacek is trying to shape public opinion and policy in Poland. So when he's out here saying, like, he came to me wanting to say that on the podcast, I think because he wanted that message out there and he wanted it in an American podcast in the English language. Like he wants, and he's been doing lots of different interviews about that. Like he wants pressure on the Polish government to follow through on what he thinks is best for Poland, which is not necessarily what the Polish government thinks so far. So like take that with a grain of salt when you're listening to him and when he's pushing that. That said, Poland put all of its eggs in the U.S. basket. It thought the way that it was going to balance some of the heavy-handed influence of Germany and France and some of these other countries in the EU was it was going to be the top U.S. ally, and that it was going to forge a bilateral defense and industrial relationship with the United States that would be able to weather any sort of problems in the transatlantic alliance. I think when the Polish government was thinking about this, it was thinking about the threat of the end of the European Union, so that it wanted to be able to have a close bilateral relationship with the United States if the EU came apart. Obviously, it's a much different scenario right now, but I think that was the fail-safe for Poland. And I think you can see Poland is on the back foot. I mean, remember during the first Trump administration, they were talking about building Fort Trump inside of Poland to try and make him happy. Maybe they should have done that. Maybe he wouldn't have soured on them if they had done so. But I think they thought it was going to be like it was in the first administration, that they were going to go to Mar-a-Lago and they were going to say all the nice things and they were going to say, "Oh, Trump is the greatest figure since the Polish kings of yesteryear," blah blah. And it just hasn't worked because the United States is not interested. So also remember that Polish politics is pretty divided. Like Tusk won the election, but he didn't win it by a huge majority, and there is all of this internal jostling within Poland itself. But I think Poland has to come to the same conclusion that most of these other EU countries have come to, which is you can't rely on the United States in the long term. And for Poland, that means re-engaging with the European Union. It means working with countries like Germany and France. And to Jacek's point, his whole thing about the intermarium, that's a fancy way of saying, hey, Poland should look south to Turkey. Because the periods of Polish history where Poland was most successful was when it had the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and when it was aligned, generally speaking, with the Ottomans or with the Turks and things like that. And there is plenty of reason for Poland to think that way. And as a result of the war, like Poland is the front line. They are the front line with Russia. And yes, I've been on here and I've been writing about how, Russia is a weak power and I don't think they're invading a NATO country. Very easy for me to say that sitting here on a lake in Madison, Wisconsin. If you're a Polish policymaker, you can't plan on that. So you really do have to be ready for, and you have to be strong enough to deter Russia from making any kind of move. And that's why I think you're seeing the intense moves from Poland out of there. So yeah, I think Poland is going to have to fall in line, and I think their biggest challenge is going to be making sure that they don't lose sovereignty in this stronger EU that is emerging, or they're not just taking orders from France and Germany, where these countries are actually listening to Poland and helping Poland's concerns. Because Poland was talking about Russia for years and nobody was paying attention to them. The French didn't care. The Germans wanted to buy natural gas. There is some vindication for them in general. So I do think it's a major change. And I mean, this is tangential, but somewhat related because we're talking about Poland. Have you ever watched 1983, Rob? I think that's the name of the show. Let me double check here. But have you watched that show?
No, I've not heard of it.
Great. It's a 2018 show, and it's set in sort of a dystopian Poland after the year 1983. I would highly recommend listeners watch it. You should watch it too. It's a really great show and a nice way of thinking about the Polish psyche and how Poland feels isolated and sort of alternative scenarios for its future that could have come. So.
Can I squeeze in one more question on Turkey before we go?
Yes, please squeeze it in.
What is your take on opportunities for Turkey, not only from an EU integration standpoint and the stuff you talked about, but specifically in terms of manufacturing and defense manufacturing capability? And how does that tie in, if at all, to some of the developments with the PKK and in Syria in the last few weeks, and Turkey sort of I don't want to say covering its butt a little bit or covering its rear, but things moving in a decent way for them on that front.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and it's hard to parse some of it. I don't think the EU Turkey alignment is real quite yet. I think Turkey sees an opportunity, and I think the EU maybe also sees an opportunity. But these are two sides that really don't trust each other, and there's going to have to be a lot of trust building before both sides are willing to engage in a meaningful way. On paper, it makes tons of sense because Turkey has a young, a much younger demographic than Europe has. It has already moved into sort of low-end manufacturing capacity for some of these different products that Europe is not making anymore, that China is beginning to beat them on. Things like drones, like Turkey has a big foothold in general. Turkey's also on more of an equal footing now with the European Union. With they've pushed their domestic food production. They've had some nice offshore gas discoveries. Like you put it together, like Turkey's coming now from more of a position of strength. So maybe they can get more things out of the European Union in negotiations than they could have before. In the meantime, though, I mean, I think you're right to point out that I haven't followed closely what was happening with the PKK, but the idea that the PKK is going to lay down its arms and that maybe the Kurdish insurgency will go away, that would be really helpful from Turkey's perspective. It can focus on other things. What's happening in Syria, happening very quietly, I think. I think people are not focusing on it. Yes, the Israelis, I think we talked about how the Israelis are running around, seizing Syrian villages and things like that, which is crazy. But what happened this week was that the SDF, which is the Syrian Kurdish group, they're sort of cousins of the Turkish Kurds, signed a deal to participate in the Syrian government. The Syrian government, by the way, some pretty brutal reprisals against Alawites and against Assad supporters in the country over the past week. I mean, that's what happens when a war ends. But pretty depressing to watch that play out. But the SDF news was a big deal because now instead of the Kurds existing in their own independent statelet in northwestern Syria, now they're trying to integrate themselves into the state. And I would guess that what the Syrian Kurds saw was that they were in an indefensible position and that Turkey was going to obliterate them if they didn't do something. And so they wanted to join the Syrian government, which nominally will point towards Ankara, or at least will be more susceptible to Turkish influence. And maybe if they're part of that state, Turkey will leave them alone. Maybe they can have some measure of autonomy, not unlike the KRG in Iraq. So they don't lose all of the gains that they made without having them at risk from what Turkey is going to do. So all of that to me says, things are happening nicely in Turkey's backyard. Some of this is also going to depend on what's happening with the U.S. and Iran. We didn't even talk about that, but Trump claims he sent a letter to Ali Khamenei, and Iran says we didn't get any letter. Is there going to be an Iran nuclear deal? There's also the issue of Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, which continues to be, just for Turkey, it's a big problem because Erdogan, staked some of his reputation on being a defender of the Palestinians. He has not defended them, and the situation is going. I mean, it can't get much worse, but it's somehow getting worse. I don't know if you've seen some of the rhetoric from the White House about Hamas and the Palestinians still in the Gaza Strip. I mean, it's kind of, you have to pinch yourself to think that it's real, that it's coming out of the mouth of the U.S. president. But none of that is particularly good for Turkey anyway. So I don't know. You put it together. Like I think Turkey's going to play all sides here. Like it's not like they're going to throw away their relationship with Russia. It's not like they're going to throw away their relationship with China. But it does make sense, especially if the United States is withdrawing from Europe a little bit, for Turkey to try and fill some of that power vacuum and to try and get a better deal there with Europe. And for Europe, it's I don't know. We're going to see just how self-righteous the Europeans are, because they're going to have to get over this Europeanness notion if they're going to let Turkey into the bloc. And I don't know if Europe is capable of that. The flip side of all the things we've talked about with Europe, you've talked about it here plenty of times before. What is the big hot button issue that always moves politics in the European Union? It's migration. And why is it migration? Well, because Europeans are more racist than just about anybody else in the world. They don't like when people who are not their nationality come into their country. So it sets off all these different problems. You talk about the integration of Muslims into French society or Syrians into German society. I mean, like these are all big problems. It's things that Europe has never really succeeded at. So to go from that to, oh yeah, we're going to let Turkey into the EU as a full member, like I said, a lot of cultural change has to happen in order for that to occur. Now, maybe the geopolitics is strong enough to overrule it, and I can make the case on paper for why those things make sense. But it's hard to overstate what a big sea change it would have to be for both sides to come to the table and sort of and agree to that. If they can, it tells you something very real about how pragmatic the European Union is looking at the world.
Well, they may come in, but there's no way on God's green earth that they're going to come in with the right of migration, in the Schengen zone without any restrictions. Like we don't have to speculate. It's not like that's just never going to happen. I'll sit here and say that right here on March 11th, 2025.
I'm not saying that that has to happen to make it the deal, but that idea that it would never happen because the Europeans don't like Muslims, like that's going to have to change. Like maybe Erdogan will take something in return for not having Schengen or any of those things, or maybe they'll get rid of Schengen in general. We've already seen Schengen suspended as a result of COVID and the war and some other migration issues in general. So maybe if you just get rid of that concept and just say, hey, you're going to need your EU passport or some way to get across, you can fix it. But the reflexive notion of no, we're not letting Turks in here. What are you talking about? Like that has to go away, I think, because I don't think Erdogan's going to come to the table if he's treated like a second class citizen. Like he's not going to do that for Turkey. So it's really going to have to be Europe looking at Turkey and saying, we need you. And Turkey looking at the EU and saying, yeah, we need you too. Like this would be a good thing for Turkey in the future. I think we're a long way from that. But on paper, if you're just looking at the naked geopolitical interests, stronger EU-Turkish relations make a lot more sense than they have at any point in the last 25 years. So.
Just one clarification question, and this is a
Mm-hmm.
total downer after a nice way to end it. That would have
Oh,
been.
great. Cool.
Um, Not a downer, just to understand the PKK decision to suddenly declare that they're going to throw down their arms. How exactly is that related to events in Syria? Is that yeah? Is it related? Like, just help me understand the different groups there and how they all fit in. Because this guy's been in jail for like 26 years, and now just this week, he's calling for a ceasefire. So clearly something
Yeah, and
happened.
and we'll see if his call is heeded by he has been in jail for quite some time, so we will see um, if anything actually comes of that. Um, the the way to think about this, and by the way, as I was looking at this, it looks like there's a story here, that Turkey and Iran recalled some of their ambassadors due to diplomatic friction following Iranian criticism of Turkey's Syria policy. So going to what I was talking about, like I think maybe Iran is sort of the next shoe that has to drop for Turkey before it can really turn its attention away from the Middle East and more towards Europe and things like that. To answer your question, we have to do a really, really quick geography of the Kurds. So the Kurds are not a monolith. They speak many different languages. Some of them have even different religions. They reside in different countries. They come from different geographies, all these other different sorts of things. In Iraq, after Saddam tried to invade Kuwait, there was a Kurdish civil war. So, I mean, that sort of tells you everything you need to know about the Kurds themselves. Very, very crudely simplifying. You've got some Iranian Kurds, you've got Iraqi Kurds, you've got Syrian Kurds, and you've got Turkish Kurds. Of those different groups, the Turkish Kurds and the Syrian Kurds are the most closely related. They're the ones that have the most in common, whether it's linguistically, culturally, from a family perspective. They're very, very different from the Iraqi Kurds and very, very different from the Iranian Kurds. Those are almost completely different languages, and you should almost think of them as completely different groups. So I jokingly said, like the Syrian Kurds are the cousins of the Turkish Kurds. So there are familial ties there. There are ties of affinity between those different groups. Now, it's not one to one. What the PKK does and what the Turkish Kurds does not line up one to one with what the Syrian Kurds are doing. But if the PKK is putting down its arms, and if the PKK says it wants to wind down its insurgency inside of Turkey, you can bet that the Syrian Kurds are watching that and thinking, okay, maybe we also need to like make peace with Turkey in our own way. Because if they're doing that, that means all the more so attention Turkey could take and focus on us in general. And maybe they've even talked to their Turkish cousins and said, okay, that's your strategy. Maybe you guys have assurances from the Turkish government. Maybe we're going to have assurances from the Turkish government as well. So that's the way to think about it. Certainly not a one-to-one ratio, but if any of these different Kurdish groups are going to listen to each other, the SDF will have its finger on the pulse of what's going on with the PKK and vice versa. Whereas like what's happening with the KRG, what's happening in Iran, that's going to be another world away. That's a very crude simplification. And if there are any Kurdish listeners, please feel free to correct me. But that is how I understand the lay of Kurdish geography. If the Kurds could ever put aside these differences and all speak one language and unite from a political perspective, they'd be one of the strongest countries in the Middle East. I mean, they sit on incredibly important strategic real estate. There's 40 plus million of them, all these other different things. But the thing that has always cut against them is that they're not really a nationality. They're something between an ethnic group and a nation. They're really interesting to think about and talk about in that sense, because their identity has not congealed in that way into a single national identity.
I think after this episode, you're going to get a nasty call from your sister and a nasty call from some Kurdish listeners for not appreciating all the nuances of their.
Oh, I'm 95% sure that my sister does not listen to this podcast, and I would be overjoyed if we had enough Kurdish listeners to write hate mail at me. I've long loved Kurdish ideas and culture and things like that, and I would be more than happy to be corrected on anything I just said. So. All right, so not so much of a downer. All right, I'll let you get back to your lunch with the Italian French or the French Italians or whatever it is you guys are doing.
Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob SHAP, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.